My name is Jesse Morgan Barnett, and I'm the Assistant Curator of Education here at the Modern. Part of the delight in having this new recent position here is that I'm able to think about and provide what are hopefully useful situations for the arts community in the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan areas. I think that if we're able to, at times, reassess our perspectives, altering our perception of objects, lives, and events, essentially arts and culture, I hope that the possibilities of art remain compelling. Tonight we're here for a very special lecture by the French curator, art critic, and author of theoretical essays on contemporary art, Nicolas Bourriaud. Tonight in the audience I see a nice range of artists and historians, and curators, students, and educators. It pleases me to have such a diverse group present this evening. So thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us tonight here. As I said before, Nicolas Bourriaud is a French curator, art critic, and author of theoretical essays on contemporary art. He co-founded, and from 1999 to 2006, was the director of the Palais de Tokyo, together with Jérôme Sans. Nicolas was also founder and director of the contemporary art magazine Documents sur l'Art from 1992 to 2000, and a correspondent in Paris for Flash Art from 1987 to 1995. Bourriaud was the Gulbenkian curator of contemporary art from 2008 to 2010 at the Tate Britain in London, and in 2009 he curated the fourth Tate Triennial there, entitled Altermodern. His writings have been translated into over 15 languages, and publications include Playlist, Relational Aesthetics, Postproduction, Radicant, Altermodern, and the upcoming X-Form, to be released in 2016. His curatorial activity is vast and impressive, and some of the projects include Aperto, 93, the Venice Biennale, 1993, Traffic at the CAPC Bordeaux, 1996, Touch at the San Francisco Art Institute in 2002, GNS, Global Navigation System, at the Palais de Tokyo in 2003, Moscow Biennale, 2005 and 2007, Estratos Contemporary Art Project in Murcia, 2008, the Athens Biennale in 2011, Monodrome, Cookbook at the Palais des Beaux-Arts, Paris, 2013, the Taipei Biennial, 2014, the Great Acceleration in Taiwan, and the Kaunas Biennial 2015, his most recent project, Threads, a phantasmagoria about distance in Lithuania. His resume is quite impressive, and it does go on and on, so I will leave it there. It's a great privilege. I've been anticipating this event for quite some time, and I would like to thank you for being here, Nicolas. It's been a pleasure spending the last few days with you, and a real honor, great memory. If you all could help me in welcoming Nicolas to the Modern, I would appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Jesse. It was a bit too long, maybe. So I try to be, not to be too long myself, actually, but it's a complex subject I wanted to talk to you about today. It's an ongoing process of writing, which actually starts from something which was not really seen or perceived as something important in the 80s when it started. It's the idea of the Anthropocene as the new period of time in which humanity is entering into, the planet Earth is entering into. In the 80s, no, it was not so obvious for us, actually. But what is Anthropocene? It succeeds to the Holocene, which was actually, we were actually into the Holocene for 10,000 years. And Anthropocene is characterized by the visible impact of human activities on planet Earth. And this is something that we can actually acknowledge today. And we're going to talk about it later on. So this is a new geophysical era, actually, the Anthropocene. Anthropos, humanity, and the way our activities are actually striking the biosphere. Massive deforestation, pollution of the soil, the seas, and the air is responsible, for example, for the melting of the great glaciers. And the biosphere itself is being altered by the action of our species, actually, as an entity. And this impact is now much more powerful than any other natural force. And that's something which is actually transforming completely our relationship to our surroundings and even our relationships between humans. Because Anthropocene is also a time of crisis for what I call the human scale. What are we actually compared to these huge modifications? And the fact is, if we look at ourselves, we feel all more or less helpless. Helpless, for example, in the face of a computerized economic system, which is animated by the impulses of algorithms, which are actually performing operations at the speed of light. This is what we call high-frequency trading, which is actually today something like 75% of all the financial activities in the United States. It's huge. It's operated by machines. It's not actually vaguely controlled, of course, but it goes by itself all the time. It seems that human beings have been victims of the infrastructure they have been producing in the last centuries, and that we are helpless spectators of an economy which is more and more detached from any production on a human scale. And this situation that we all experience one way or another actually contributes to the emergence of new ways of thinking. And I think the artists are actually seeing this in a very clear way and for more time than we think sometimes. Human scale, it's interesting because, for example, it could be an exhibition to be made actually. It's the history of the scale of how the artists see and how we human beings see ourselves within the landscape, for example. It could be an history of human scale in painting, for example. That's a good exhibition to be made. Just think about have a look at it if you can, if you don't know it. But if you see the Fall of Icarus by Bruegel, you will see a huge and magnificent landscape, and at the very bottom of the scene, which is presented by Bruegel, just a little man falling down at the very far away. Actually, it's like it's a non-event in a way. And compare it to Andy Warhol's disasters, for example. The juxtaposition of the two is very interesting to be made. Think about the Dutch landscapes in the 17th century, for example. You have no human beings are really small, actually, on this. But today, things have totally changed, and it seems that there is kind of new, what I could call it a new coalition, in a way, between the individual, the citizens, us, and a kind of new subordinate class, which is not only constituted by human beings, it's also animals, vegetation, minerals, atmosphere. All of this actually are now part of the game we're all playing into. And they're all imperiled by a techno-industrial system which is now clearly detached from civil society. So the theme of the Anthropocene appears as a revelation of the disquieted consciousness of the inhabitant of a globalized world where the Earth's atmosphere itself has come under threat. And we are not now driven to renegotiate the terms of our presence in the world with all living things, as well as with our technological creations. It's a new set of parameters we're entering into and that we have to consider today. And obviously, it has consequences on the way we represent our universe and then on art. We have to reevaluate our relationship with all the forces with which we must coexist on the planet. And that's my starting point, actually. The fact that I feel more and more that in the art world, in exhibitions, in studios, artists are actually envisioning a totally different way to represent our presence on this planet. Just a little anecdote, which is, I'm sure you all know this, but it's very striking. Last year, or 2 years ago, actually, in 2013, it was actually, we noticed that there were more robots than human beings on the internet, actually. Online is more populated now by a majority of machines, and the human being is a minority, actually circulating online. This makes me think, because it's kind of it's a crazy information in a way, and nobody seems to notice that. It's quite surprising. We have become, as human beings, as individuals, we are personal data. Personal data, which is collected by those machines, by those robots, and it's now the core of our economy. I think algorithms, those modes of calculation, which are actually allow those machines to collect those informations, are as important for the economy today than production line in 19th century. It's driving the whole economy. Personal data and algorithms. It goes hand in hand, in a way, with global warming and with the rise also of our interest for animal rights. All this is describing a situation in which we human beings are actually acknowledging the fact that we are not all alone anymore, and that we are not only working for us, but it's a scene which is more complex than it ever was. It's a new relational landscape that we're living in a way, in which humans seem to occupy the same secondary position that the economic logic of globalization relegates to raw materials. Our personal data is like a raw material which is actually fueling the economy. So we are more or less at the same level as fossil fuels, livestock, or sunlight. That should make us think also. But while this theme of the Anthropocene and its consequences seem to be entering our consciences on a philosophical or political level, its aesthetic implications remain to be more analyzed. Actually, that's what I'm actually trying to do with those first level of data. There is a current trend in philosophy all over the world at the moment, which could be summed up as the object-oriented philosophies. Those philosophies seek to establish a kind of relationship of equivalence between the various components of physical reality. And since the turn of the century, it's more and more obvious and visible, artists have started a new dialogue with other forms of life, as well as objects, actually. And we can see in the last years, actually, the emergence of such notions like animism, transhumanism, post-internet art, and the currently very trendy philosophical domain called speculative realism. For example, this American philosopher named Levi Bryant, who wrote a book about the democracy of objects. His really strong line is, there is only one type of beings. 2 points, objects. I quote him, "This essay," he writes, "attempts to think an object for itself that isn't an object for the gaze of a subject, for a representation or a cultural discourse. The claim that all objects equally exist is the claim that no object can be treated as constructed by another object. In short, no object such as the subject or culture is the ground of all others." I will try to dwell on it, don't worry. Another philosopher, French philosopher, Bruno Latour, talks about a parliament of things. It's more or less the same idea. And I will start to get into the aesthetic field with two artists, one British, Mark Leakey, and Pierre Huyghe, who's French, who recently had a show at LACMA in Los Angeles, who are actually addressing topics very similar. Mark Leakey, and here is a detail from an installation that was actually at the Venice Biennial 2013, if my memory is correct. Mark Leakey calls for a relationship with objects which would be freed from the mediation of language. And think about the quotation of Levi Bryant that I did. That's exactly the same idea. No object can be treated as constructed by another subject. That's exactly the same idea. And Mark Leakey says, I quote, "You can talk about, or rather involve yourself with objects, without continuous recourse to concepts and critique, not only approaching them as though they are only organized by language, by us. You can try and empathize with them on a whole other level." A recent exhibition of Pierre Huyghe, and I took also this example because in Dallas Modern you can see in the chalet, which is curated by Piero Goria, another work which is quite similar to this one by Pierre Huyghe. This exhibition, it was at the Pompidou Center in Paris. For this exhibition, Pierre Huyghe has focused on animal life, bees, dogs, mollusks, bacteria even, actually, because he was actually working with the virus of flu within this exhibition, or ants. He's actually proposing a kind of hypothetical, between brackets, world without humans, in which life would come into being through the production of forms, with kind of unpredictable and accidental dimension all the time. So Pierre Huyghe reverses the conventions between the artist and the viewer. That's where I want to lead you. Also reverses the convention between objects and human consciousness then. Affirming, for example, that an exhibition is not meant, and I quote him, to exhibit something to someone, but to exhibit someone to something. In other words, he thinks that art is an experience. You are exposed in the exhibition room. You are exposed to something. And that's what art is about, in a way. It's a very synthetic way of seeing it. The most important thing is your experience within that room. So this reversion is not totally absurd. It's even quite logical in a way, but it's a very new way of saying it. Not exhibiting something to someone, but exhibiting someone or exposing someone to something. So this experience that Pierre Huyghe is actually exposing us to is defined by kind of absolute contingency, randomness. It's made of accidents, actually. No one knows exactly what this... You see in this aquarium, there is a little crab who inhabits the Brancusi mask. This life has taken over art in a way and uses art as a kind of helmet or a protection, as we can see sometimes, in the sea. Actually, I don't remember the exact name of this animal in English, but it's a kind of nomadic mollusk. So the viewer is assigned a role as active witness of the exhibition. You have this idea of experience and the idea that you, as a beholder, you are an active witness of what's going on in the exhibition. And what Pierre says, in a way, is that encounters are more important than forms. Encounters is what happens between you and the form, in a way. This is much more important than the form itself. And this is something I started to think about when I wrote Relational Aesthetics, but I still hold on firmly on this. That's a close-up on this animal which is inhabiting the Brancusi sculpture in this aquarium at the Pompidou Center. And that's another inhabitant of Pierre Huyghe's exhibition, a dog with a pink leg, who actually was, inhabiting literally the exhibition and had some missions to accomplish within the exhibition. Mark Leakey again. This recent Mark Leakey evokes as also a direct and empathetic relationship with the object, like the quotation I made a few minutes ago. A relationship which wouldn't be organized by language. So doing this, I tend to think that he echoes the aspirations of previous artists like Cézanne, actually, or Giacometti even, where actually whose common point was that they were both thinking to penetrate the secret structures of the visible through the process of deconditioning our gaze. And to define his own explorations, Pierre Huyghe, on the other hand, uses a quite similar phrase. The purpose of art, he says, is to, between brackets, increase the presence of what is. We're in fact not far from the ambitions of Cézanne and Giacometti, as I said, because to render as accurately as possible the shock that occurs when the visible is made manifest, the kind of majesty with which the world unfolds under our eyes, whether it's a basket of fruit or the Mount Sainte-Victoire, it's not the problem. And this recent exhibition by Mark Leakey that I've been showing here, which is called, the title says everything, the Universal Addressability of Dumb Things, 2013. He actually references a concept from information technology that a network of objects could communicate without the intervention of an agent gifted with consciousness, without the intervention of any human. And you see, as you see here, it's a detail. The main portion of the exhibition consisted of a museum display of objects. It could be on the floor, on pedestals, as you can see here, or hanging on the wall, which are all positioned frontally and embedded somehow in a green monochrome environment. So those artifacts are from many different times and places, and their status actually also is very diverse. But if they reflect the current of thought that the artist calls techno-animism, animism, the idea of giving a soul to something, then this exhibition, the universal addressability of dumb things, seems to point to a core that resists all attempt to avoid the human, on the other hand. Because the whole installation, as you can see, but there are more detailed view of this exhibition, but we can also see this. The whole exhibition evokes kind of prosthetic network, a body reduced to spare parts. And that's really something that the artist actually makes visible. And I quote him again. Approaching an object as if it has some essential property that the artist attempts to draw out of it isn't something taught at art school anymore. Sometimes it is. But now I feel we've entered, he goes on, we've entered a strange new sensory realm. The vivid and mortal sensations created by the convincing visual surface texture of HD, the warm regard you feel towards your stamped metal devices, or the aboriginal shudder you get watching ASMR videos on YouTube. Paradoxically, he concludes, cold, autistic cyberspace takes us back to an appreciation of sensuality. That's this very paradoxical idea, which is the core, I think, of the work of Mark Leakey. The more we get technological, and this kind of ASMR, this kind of feel-good videos that you can find on YouTube is a good example of it. You know, there's something that resists. The human, our sensuality cannot be completely, erased. And we are surprised anew by the presence of the world through the resources provided by our nervous system, even connected with machines. So if Mark Leakey intends to approach objects without any recourse to language or describe their interconnections without any human mediation, it is ultimately in order to relate with them, sensually. And on the other hand, I go on with my opposition between the two. Pierre Huyghe tends to empty his work of all traces of personal subjectivity. But in doing so, he focuses more on the viewer. And so what's the common point between the two artists? Actually, I think that they embody two different assumptions within a general movement. And this general movement is a movement which is, I think, almost invisible, but for me the strongest one since the beginning of 21st century. It's the shattering of the subject-object relationship. This link between subject and object, if you think about it, has formed most of Western philosophy since at least the Descartes and Kant, but even from the Greek philosophy. Subject-object is something we don't even think about it because it's so obvious for us. It's the relationship also between the viewer and the work, then, which is at stake here. And that is something which is evolving under our eyes, and it's a huge modification of our perception. Our position in the world is changing, and the first victim of it, in a way, is this relationship, very steady, very stable, for centuries and millennium even, subject-object. But we'll come back about it, and we'll try to analyze it more carefully. At this moment, and I've been quoting a few signs of it, human thought is turning towards things. Exactly like if it was looking for a new equilibrium, in a way. At the very moment, and I come back to the idea of the Anthropocene, at the very moment when our species has become aware of its disastrous takeover of the planet. This is the historical context of the Anthropocene. And this historical context brings a new theoretical constellation which is constituted by those object-oriented philosophies I mentioned. And those, this way of thinking could be summed up by the idea that animals, plants, objects must be treated on an equal footing with human beings. So I told you, Bruno Latour talks about a parliament of things, Levi Bryant, a democracy of objects. Graham Harman, another American philosopher, proposes what he calls this object-oriented philosophy that attempts to free objects from the shadow of the human consciousness, giving them autonomy somehow, and putting, for example, collisions between things on an equal footing with relationships between thinking subjects like you and me. So that these two types of relations, collisions between things, and relationship between subjects, only differ according to the degree of complexity, but it's the same thing, according to him. Humans can only be distinguished from others, according to Harman, by their status as sensual objects. We, human beings, are sensual objects. Another philosopher belonging to the same movement, let's say, a French philosopher called Quentin Meillassoux, stands against a world which he considers as anti-realistic, in which nothing could exist outside of a correlation between a subject and an object. How we go again. On one side is thought, and on the other side is being. And the relationship between subject and object correlates the two all the time. But actually the human individual, us, are only one element among others in this network that equals reality. Actually, we're not everything in this reality. That's the very well-known example of the tree that falls in the forest. If nobody sees this tree falling, does it really fall? That's exactly the same philosophical problem here. But what would be an art exhibition without this correlation between subject and object? Actually, if you think about it 1 minute, it's just impossible. Art is totally artificial. Art doesn't exist without our presence. I love to quote this very famous line from Marcel Duchamp, saying that it's the beholder who makes the picture. And it's truer than ever, actually. Art is actually an activity amongst all human activities, which is purely based on our presence, our consciousness, to acknowledge the exhibition, let's say, the artwork. Besides that, there's no possible art, actually. The concept of art itself is nothing other than artificial reality between subject and object. It's interesting. There's a French writer, Roger Caillois, who classified actually all the forms that exist. And he only found 4 types, actually. And I've been trying to find a 5th one, but I never could. And it's true that everything that you see around you is any form that you see in your surroundings proceeds according to one of these 4 types. Growth, the tree is growing, all the vegetables are growing, even the stones actually are also naturally evolving. So growth, molding, reproduction of the same by a mold. Accident, that's the tree that falls in the forest. It creates a form, but it's just an accident. Or will, human will. Could be animal will sometimes. So growth, molding, accident, or will. That's the only four possibilities for a form to exist in our world. And that's the intertwining of those four possibilities for a form that are actually constituting what we call art. Artists use indifferently and sometimes all those four possibilities, but it's always will that's the most important. An artist decides to exhibit, to create, to produce such or such form. And let's come back to Pierre Huyghe and Mark Leakey, our examples. With Leakey, we could speculate on the existence of a network of interconnected objects. Why not? This corresponds to the Cézannean endeavor to scrutinize things, to search for their secret existence from the structure of their relationships. On the other hand, with Pierre Huyghe, it's more about life form installations whose various elements are imparted by contingency, so that the viewer's gaze constitutes only one facet among others, in a situation that exceeds all individual consciousness all the time. You can acknowledge this, but the day after, the dog is not at the same place. It will always change. It's never the same thing that you see in the exhibition. It does evolve. It grows all the time. These modes of thought in art, as in philosophy, reflect a general atmosphere in which there is a dissociation, a fundamental split affecting this subject-object relationship. Our existences have been structured over the course of centuries around this face-à-face exchange between the ego and the world. And now it seems to be in crisis, problematical at least. And all the effort to achieve a possible new harmony, if that term may be used, are converging around the idea of kind of horizontalization of our representations, a kind of networking of various protagonists, animals, vegetables, the atmosphere, etc., machines, various protagonists then, and that might be this horizontality which makes a philosopher like Levi Bryant say that there's only one type of being, the object. When Pierre Huyghe defines an exhibition as a place to exhibit someone to something, he indicates that the traditional categories of passivity and activity no longer have a reason to exist. And all modern art has been structured by this idea of activity and passivity, actually. The active agent here is not necessarily a human individual, and the object is not necessarily inert, like in Mark Leakey's idea of interconnected objects that can talk one to another, through machines without our collaboration. So a subject-object relationship does not inevitably represent a relationship of domination by a first over a second. This relationship between the living and the inert, and we could question those categories also, seems to be the main tension in contemporary culture. And artificial intelligence has come to occupy the middle ground, actually, as a kind of referee, if you want. There's a lot that has been written about it, for example, in science fiction, actually, and I'm thinking of one of my favorite authors, Philip K. Dick, who has explored the boundaries between humans and machines. Think about Blade Runner, for example, on the Turing test, to determine if the replicant is a human being or not. What is absolutely obvious in the artworks of this early 21st century is the presence of what we could call a circuit of the living. Things are seen as beings most of the time. And those objects that we can see in those installations are presented as energy converters, catalysts, or messengers sometimes. In a way, what has been called animism, the idea of giving the object a soul, is a kind of unidirectional. And I think today, it's more complex than that. There's always back and forth between different reigns, between different realms, what I could call a coactivity of all the elements that actually are part of life, inert or not, who are actually playing together and which are displayed by artists today. It's like art was appropriating life in all directions, or exploring all the degrees of the biosphere. So it can produce, for example, a poetic machinery, robotic or vegetated humans, plants connected to sensors, animals actually working for us, etc. You see all that in exhibitions today. It's always oscillating between there are two main processes. One is reification, transformation of the living into a thing, an object. And the other one, which is a bit less known, is it's a term of rhetoric, of linguistic. It's called prosopopeia, complicated word, but it's the idea of it's a figure of speech, if you want, that represents a thing having a voice, like you can see in cartoons, for example, since for ages. So, in a way, contemporary art has largely anticipated the speculations of the current philosophers. And the contemporary artists are not restricting that to that unique category of objects, which is the living. Might give an example of it. I don't have a picture of it, but you will understand the process, I think, very, very easily. There's a Swedish artist called Ola Persson who built a very strange machinery. He actually took a yucca tree, one of those banal, small trees that you have in houses, and he connected this yucca tree to sensors who actually could record its pulsations, let's say, the small, tiny movements of life that the yucca tree can have. And he connected those movements to a software that he built, who actually was made to buy stock options on the market. And he connected the yucca tree, gave the yucca tree, I think it was 10,000 euros or something like that, like $12,000 for a month. And the yucca tree was buying and selling stock options for a month. And believe me or not, he didn't lose a dime. Well, he even earned a little bit of money, actually. So if a yucca tree can do it, I guess we all can. But what's interesting in this experience is, this idea of actually involving vegetal into economy and robotics. Actually, it's again a kind of line linking, the most, banal living element and the economical superstructure. And it maybe might give us an idea of the dominant forms of the art of the 2012s, of today, actually. Because beyond the trends that generally borrow their styles from the past, we can have a look at the art of 21st century as an art of the alloy or montage, if you want, which derives directly from the dominant context of production and distribution, which is namely the digital world. So, for me, the originality of the artist today does not come from a specific style of painting, of sculpture, of film, or whatever, but it comes from his or her ability to invent modes of liaison between heterogeneous elements. Since artists are now aspiring to apprehend all living beings and objects, physical, social objects, exactly on the same level. So the sequence has become more important than the shot, to say it in one line. Or in the lexicon of computers, if you want, the download mode is more important than the content of the site. Let's see, for example, artists like Rachel Rose, an American artist. It's actually taken from a video. And what's really characteristics of our work, and you see here again, that's why I wanted to just have one or two stills, those relationship between forms which are actually coming from different realms. You see a kind of intertwining of vegetal-like forms, computerized forms, and her films, actually, this one is something like 15 minutes, but it would have been too long to have a look at it from A to Z, are actually built according to very interesting logics of montage. It's sometimes very fast, and you can see also this style of videos today. I don't know if we have something by Ed Atkins, who's also on display at the moment, also in Dallas, by the way, but I didn't pick it on purpose. But do we have like 1 minute for a video of Ed Atkins? No, okay, let's forget about it, no problem. Well, what I want to say, what I want to stress on, is the fact that the important artists of our time, according to me, and for the reasons I tried to explain from the beginning, are perhaps those who invent original circuits of forms instead of relying on a kind of iconographic source that would be unique. Their style, if we can use this word, is the movement they invent, the mode of connection that they establish between different images or different forms or different signs. And one of the most striking formal characteristics of our time turns out to be, for me, this mode of composition via circuits, which extends to the construction of environments combining objects, sounds, still images and moving images. And that's something also that's very present in today's exhibitions. But we can go back a little bit in the past, thinking about the art of the last 20 years. And I wanted to take as another example certain photographs of Gabriel Orozco, that you know because there was an exhibition about Mexican art 2 years ago here, right? Yeah. So I guess you might be familiar with his work, who actually perfectly recreates this sensation. And what I'm interested in this image is the following thing. It's a good example of his work, because you see on the surface of quite banal and wretched objects that he uses, we perceive the trace of a gesture, a human gesture mainly. Sometimes it's a mist coming from a breath, sometimes it's fingerprints. Here it's just this kind of circular, trace that's made by a bike. All signs of a complete withdrawal of the human. All signs of its dissolution in a universe that the human now dominates, okay, but within which all distance separating him or her from things and phenomena has been totally abolished. And that's what I'm really interested in his work. Because the Anthropocene is also the space of this promiscuity I was talking about. This kind of brutal bringing together of all ranks and spheres in a space which is suddenly devoid of any symbolic boundaries. There's not anymore the humans and whatever is not human. It's more complex than that. It's a universe without skin, in a way. We are exposed completely. Our skin has disappeared, and we have to envision ourselves without skins. We are more and more porous with whatever is not human, whatever it is. And it allows us to understand, to better understand the ambition of Pierre Huyghe I was telling you about at the beginning of this speech, not to exhibit something to someone, but to exhibit someone to expose, might be a better translation, expose someone to something. Because in the Anthropocene, promiscuity, everything is being exposed. And the subject has lost its monopoly even on the gaze. As I was mentioning this from Mark Leakey's work. It's look, thinking about it. Sorry, I was thinking of a very interesting thesis made by the French psychoanalyst and philosopher Jacques Lacan already in 1964. He was saying that the world was omnivoyeur. And I hope that you get this idea of a multiple gaze. But he didn't really refer to the notion of human consciousness, neither. I quote him, I see only from one point, my pair of eyes, I see only from one point, but in my existence, I'm looked at from all sides. That's our condition, actually. We are looked at from all sides. We only see through one very tiny, window, which is our eyes. So he goes on, I quote again, in our relation to things, insofar as this relation is constituted by the way of vision and ordered in the figures of representation, something slips, passes, is transmitted from stage to stage, and is always, to some degree, eluded in it. That is what we call the gaze. A bit complicated, but I'm going to try to make it more understandable. I would say that what Lacan says is this difference between the vision and the human gaze, which exists, I quote, in our relation to things, and I quote, ordered in representation, that's art, could well be the key to address this new status of the subject in the art today. Another philosopher, Michel Foucault, was quite close to it, also more or less at the same period, in the 1960s. But as for the structuralist philosophy in general, it is a matter of language. And language is the blind spot of all the philosophers we have been mentioning till now. The object-oriented philosophers, they never talk about language because it's completely human for them, in a way. They never mention that. It's a real blind spot. But for Michel Foucault, it's the discursive mechanisms in place at a given time, now, for example, that coordinate knowledge as power and relegate the human subject in the background. So this appears to be the second original aspect of those object-oriented philosophies. And it's not the erasure of the human being in favor of things, because this has already been, existing in structuralism in a way in 1960s. But it's the evacuation of language, actually. The most famous book, one of the most famous books by Michel Foucault, The Order of Things, starts with a chapter devoted to Velázquez, to the description of Las Meninas by Velázquez, which is presented as a manifesto, and I actually don't have a picture of it. It could have been interesting. I forgot, sorry. But Las Meninas, Michel Foucault says, is a kind of manifesto of the thought of the classical age. The entire picture, he writes, is, I quote, is looking out at a scene for which it is itself a scene. So this erasure of the subject-object relationship is exactly the opposite of what we describe here as the omnipresence of the gaze, which is not only human, but which actually exists as a kind of natural fact, everywhere. If contemporary art has been marked those recent years by this turn towards objects that is highly and very broadly commentated everywhere. But this context might be also the context of economic globalization in some way. We didn't talk about it yet, but that's, I think, we have to envision those ideas at this level now. Because this is inseparable from a process of reification. I was saying, transforming the living into a thing. Reification. Transformation. Because in our capitalist world, we could say that life is nothing more, nothing less, but a moment of merchandising. And human beings are all caught in the process of reification. When we sell our work, for example, we are transformed into a kind of tool which corresponds to a huge machine that we participate to, actually, including myself now. The world has become a potential commodity, in a way. If you take an Amazonian plant, for example, a seed, ask Monsanto, for example, or a gesture, even, because you certainly know that some gestures have been are under copyright now, actually, which is very interesting evolution. Gestures can be copyrighted. I love the idea. That's another way to understand what Levi Bryant was writing. There is only one type of being, objects. If you take it, from an economical, political point of view, that's a very different idea that's coming to the fore. Because those object-oriented philosophies could also be described as supporting the dominant ideology and encourage us to represent the world as a kind of immense display of interconnected substances, let's say, in a completely reified landscape turned into things and nothing else. At a very early stage of the capitalist system, when Karl Marx had invented this concept of what he called commodity fetishism, he described the worker as alienated due to the absence of any living relationship with the product of his or her labor. That's what he called alienation. you don't see the way out, actually. You're caught into a process. And today, this alienation is absolutely inseparable from which is due to the working system. This alienation extends to the biological and the physical chemical also. When a company claims ownership of a plant in a patent application, for example, then life becomes a product, and natural resources are pure object of speculation. And then capitalism takes on the dimension of an environment that transforms everything into capital. So that's another way to look at this same situation I've been describing at the very beginning of this talk. And I think contemporary art takes into account all of these formations. It represents now a kind of gateway between the human and the non-human, a space where the binary opposition between subject and object dissolves and branches out in many images. The reified object can speak, the living can be petrified, you can have illusions of life, illusions of the inert, not the other way. It's like the biological map redistributes constantly, actually. And this is what I try to call coactivity. Artists trying to describe human beings in parallel with many other forces, with many other types of activities, which all are converging, actually, within the artwork. Since the 1990s, and I've tried to write about it then, art had highlighted the idea of the social sphere and held interhuman relations, could be individual or social, convivial or antagonistic, whatever, as a domain of reference, actually. What was interesting that in the mid-90s, for example, internet started to be the biggest motor for our economies and our everyday lives. And at the very beginning of this movement, it was interactions that were at the fore, which are much more important. Today, 25 years later, in a way, after the real diffusion of the internet as a tool in our lives, as I told you, machines are actually overpowering us. And they took over, in a way, not by themselves, because they've been put there, obviously, still the humans behind it. But it's a new landscape where human relationships are not the main element anymore. The current critical fortune of this object-oriented philosophies in the field of art signals another acceleration, I would say, a kind of evacuation process of humanity. And I know when I wrote this book, Relational Aesthetics, which was published in '98, actually, what they call relational art had been criticized for it being anthropocentric at the time, even humanist in some ways. And it's true that it was considering humans as an aesthetic and political milieu. That's right. And it was extending its range invasively, maybe, into the realms of objects, of networks, of nature, machinery, in a manner which is now put under suspicion. So it seems to me, today, in 2015, that the major political issue of the 21st century in art is precisely the return of humanity to all the areas we have actually vacated. Computerized finance, I was telling about a few minutes ago. Policies also fixed on the kind of very monomaniac objectives, quantifiable world. And I want to say the return of humanity, it's not to be at the center of things, of the center of this reality I've been mentioning, not to be at the center of this new relational landscape that we actually have to accept. No, nothing can be at the center of a coactive universe, at the center of those multiple coexistences that in this shared ecosystem we're actually living in. But coming back to the heart of these activities that are no longer human in name, and that's a political stake. Extend the realm of human in a kind of committed dialogue with other realms. This seems to me as a very important political task, an aesthetic task that's really present also in the art world. I don't know how much time I've been.
Say 10. So
Q&A? If you're still. I'd be happy to engage a dialogue with you if you want. Yeah?
I'm an engineer and I do object-oriented programming all day. And I think this is one of the top 10 speeches I've ever heard. Thank you for that. A person like me, where do I start? You gave one book. How would be step number 1, step 2, step 3 to start thinking this way?
Actually, it's a reflection that I'm only starting in a way, But I always prefer to, when I do a talk like that, talk about what I'm doing more than what I've done. So, so it's always better for me to deliver a kind of fresh, thinking. Sometimes it's less precise, but it's also. What I like is when it constitutes itself, also with an audience or just talking out loud. But there's no exact reference for it. I never published a book about all those matters yet. No. What I could have insisted on is the idea of the algorithm, for example. I think it's the main pattern. And I've been only talking 1 minute about it, but it would deserve a huge attention, because what is calculation? What is the quantifiable in our everyday life? And there's a huge aesthetic also fight that we have to lead, because this is the key for everything in a way, because it's so dominant in our lives. I told you, for me, it's like exactly the equivalent of what was the production line in the factory in the Fordist system, in the 19th century. The invention of Taylorism in 1893, if I remember well. It was really the most important thing at the time. And production line and Taylorism had a huge impact on aesthetics, actually. This is another story, but it's. And I think today algorithm has the same kind of impact.
I'm a production engineer also.
We're made to meet.
Thank you.
You cannot separate, art from the dominant processes, in the world of labor, in economics, in technology, etc. Art has always been, contemporary. When we say contemporary art, what is art contemporary of? That's a good question. I tend to answer that it's contemporary from the modes of production of its time. It can be against or not, but it does react, somehow to the production system. You can be at the opposite or going into against the grain or not, but it's exactly this which is the contemporary, aspect. Yeah.
Does Wolfgang Tillman's notion of one thing matters, everything matters, does that play into what you've been talking about tonight at all? I mean, did that precede that? I don't know. I'm trying to make sense of it. I'm trying to determine if I think that it's the same, or if it's maybe it would be completely unconscious of actually being what you're talking about tonight. Do you think that there's any relationship to what you're talking about and that notion if one thing matters, all things matter?
Well, knowing Wolfgang Tillman's work, a bit, it wouldn't astonish me, even if I don't know this exact theory, because he's one of the artists, for me, one of the most inventive photographers of the last 25 years. So I really admire his work a lot. I've been working with him also since '95, I think, or something like that. And John Keats wrote a letter in 1824, which was based on the idea of the negative capacity of the artist. I love this letter. I still know parts of it by heart. And Keats was saying that the artist had this ability to understand without understanding. And I think it's not a reactionary thing to say that. It's not the idea, the heroic idea of the artist. No. It's another type of understanding, another type of comprehending reality that he's talking about, I think. And it's still active. I think in Wolfgang's work, as far as I know the work, you see, clearly evolutions which are also based on different types of focuses. The hair photographs, for example, say a lot about our times. Just hair. But it's fantastic how just a single form can fold so much of our times. So we have to discuss about this, because I didn't read this specific a text or a lecture.
It being a book. Do you remember this book? And I think it was of his photographs, and I may have completely misinterpreted, but I thought it had to do with the notion of his subject, that if one thing matters, it all matters. You can't, there's no hierarchy of his subject.
Yeah,
but
it's
it seems like, yeah.
You just take a vegetable out of the, and you see everything coming, the roots are coming, and yeah. Yeah.
And I'm wrapping my head around this as well. Is there a lot of maybe death implied? I mean, a world without humans, art without viewers. You spoke earlier of the growth and will, and there were two others.
That's death.
Yeah, it just seemed very.
Gabriel Roscoe.
Yeah, I mean, is that just because you never really said it? Is this just sort of implied all along? In that how we...
Well, death is part of life, especially if you leave the human realm. It's something that's circular, regenerating, sacred.
Yeah, that's the point. It's a world without humans. We're looking at remnants of what we've done, when there's no longer a viewer.
Quentin Meillassoux, the French philosopher I was mentioning, invented a word for it. He's talking about archaefossils. For example, what happens? Do we acknowledge the fact that there were actually objects, things going on before the first gaze was actually, had appeared? In prehistoric times, things happened, but we are not there to acknowledge it, to see it. So how can we qualify those? It's very difficult to think for us human beings that there was a time when we are not here to acknowledge, all those events. Right. That's what he calls archaefossils. So it's not death, just that we are not there. But the fact is, maybe death is nothing more than before I was born. I don't remember, the world before I was born. Frankly, maybe you do. No, I don't. So maybe death is nothing else than that.
This is maybe just sort of a launch pad question, but when you speak of the return of the human, it kind of assumes we know what the human is.
Yeah.
So, and where it might go. Well, I just wondered if you wanted to share any thoughts about that, or about artists who you think are addressing aspects in interesting ways.
Yeah.
And I don't want to just talk about, the bionic man stuff that way. I mean, because I think the kind of return of the human you're referring to is more
the cyborg.
Well, and in contrast to a completely robotic capitalism or something too.
First, it's true that the idea of the return is a bit clumsy. I shouldn't say that. No, that's not exactly what I mean. It's not like Godzilla returning, It's just a kind of equilibrium to be found, and to answer with this huge question of what is the human, if I had one thing, one idea about it, it would be that it's a construction. We all are constructions. That's why I tend to think that identities are not behind us, they are in front of us. My identity as a human being is something which is, in a way, in the future, not in my past. No. Of course, I happen to be, for example, French. Okay, nobody's perfect. But then a lot of things have happened. I've been traveling, I've been living somewhere else, I've been meeting. It's a construction, and I don't want to be defined, especially by the others, through this. So that's why identity is a dynamics. It's a dynamical process. It's why I use this metaphor of the radicant plant, which is the exact opposite of the radical plant. Radical meaning which has one root, and radicant meaning an organism, a vegetal that's growing its own roots while progressing, while advancing. So you have to, dig slowly the surfaces you're actually traveling into, but it's dynamic roots that you can erase. And like ivy, for example, is a radicant plant. And if you cut the original root of an ivy, it still goes on, because it doesn't need this identity to run. It's a construction. So maybe that's the main idea I can have about human beings, but I really firmly believe in that. It's ahead of us.
Well, I guess that's why the word return was a little problematic, but it's going to be, I wish I could be around to see a lot more of it.
Maybe some people think that we're going to live, for 150 years now. So It's a new Google program, right? Well,
further questions. I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. And, thank you.
thank you for your attention.